to this seventh edition of the Languages Week at SENA. We are very pleased to have you here. And our guest today, this Tuesday, is Laura Viviana Morales for the talk about biodiversity in Colombia. Because in the Languages Week, we want to enrich and acknowledge the richness of our country, and precisely one of these is the biodiversity. Laura Viviana Morales is originally from Colombia. She holds a PhD in ecology from the University of California and a bachelor in ecology and evolutionary biology from Princeton University. For the last 12 years, she has researched and worked in several tropical forests and savanna landscapes in Latin America, with a lot of time spent living in and studying in rural communities of the Peruvian Andes and the Amazon. She is passionate about connecting research with socio-environmental needs through her experience in the design and implementation of basic and applied research. Her research interests cover topics in ecological restoration, agroforestry, tropical ecology, ecosystem processes, and conservation. Prior to joining ICRAF, she worked as a university lecturer, researcher, technician, and translator at the School for Field Studies UC Davis, Princeton University, and Asociación para la Conservación de la Cuenca Amazónica. Welcome, Laura, to our seventh edition of the Languages Week. We are very pleased to have you here. How are you, Laura?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Omar. Thank you to the SENA for inviting me. Welcome to all of the audience members, wherever you are right now. That's the thing about technology. You could be anywhere in the world right now. As Omar said, my name is Laura Morales. I am an ecologist, originally from Colombia. I am going to be talking to you today about Colombia's biodiversity, but I am also fully bilingual, and I do encourage, this being the Language Week and being in English, that you feel free to ask me any questions either about biodiversity or any expressions that I may use in English that are unfamiliar to you. Please, there are no stupid questions. Great. So with that, I'm going to start. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Colombia's biological charm. You know, it's encanto. You've probably heard that Colombia is a mega diverse country at some point in time in your life, especially if you're in Colombia. And I want to give you the context for that and what that actually means. But first, I want you to take a minute, close your eyes. I'm inviting you to close your eyes and visualize your typical day. So do close your eyes. I'm going to be counting. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, okay? So maybe you get up in the morning. What do you see when you look out your window? What do you have for breakfast? When you leave your house to go to work or school, what type of environment do you walk through? Do you interact with any animals, any plants? When you have lunch again, what do you eat? And once you go home, what do you see out the taxi window or as you walk home? The reason I asked you to do this visualization exercise is because we're often immersed in biodiversity, and especially in tropical countries like Colombia and Peru, where I am right now, but we take it kind of for granted unless we work in the environmental fields. You know, it's there and it's common every day that we don't realize how amazing it is. So today, what I hope to do, and I hope that by the end of this talk, you feel like, wow, Colombia is a really biodiverse country, and I am privileged to live in such a place. Okay. So today, first, I'm going to talk to you about Colombia's biological diversity in numbers, and we'll meet some of the protagonists of this diversity. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about why we have so much biodiversity, some of the ideas in ecology as to why Colombia is such a rich country. And then if there's time at the end, I'd like to end with some ideas about shifting the conversation strictly from biodiversity to considering biocultural diversity and how that can help us move forward both as a society and as a world. Okay, first, let's touch on some basic ideas so that we're all talking the same language. So you've probably heard biodiversity and you have an idea of what it is, right? So, but what is biodiversity and how is it measured, right? Diversity in general is referring to a variety of types of things, variation, right? And that could be apples, that could be a variety of cars. A diversity is agnostic of what it is. Bio is referring obviously to living things. So biodiversity is the variation of living things. Okay. And probably when you think of biodiversity, you're thinking of the diversity of species. That's the way we commonly refer to biodiversity. But in reality, biodiversity can have many different organization levels and scales. So at different spaces, right? We can start considering from very tiny scales, looking at DNA and RNA of organisms. So that's the genetic diversity. Going up to individual plants and animals, species diversity. Going up to the diversity of the biological communities they compose. And then finally, all the way to ecosystem diversity, right? So ecosystem in this case refers to the conjunction of living things and their non-living environment. We're going to touch on that a little bit later, so keep that in mind. But there are also different ways to think about diversity. In ecology, we consider functional biodiversity, the different functions that organisms do in a community. And we can also consider phylogenetic diversity that has to do with how different lineages are related to each other and how many different lineages there are in a place. But today we're going to mostly talk about species diversity because that is the most common way in which we use diversity in everyday language and in conservation action. Okay, so now how is biodiversity measured? So one common way is to basically count the number of species. We refer to that as species richness. Another way, which we use it mostly in science and also in conservation, we use diversity indices that account for the number of species, so the species richness, but also balance it with the abundance of each species relative to others in whatever it is we're measuring. So for example, if you look at the image that I have here at the bottom, right? On the left, we have an ecosystem that has a flower, a bird, and a tree species. So we have 3 species. And here on the right, we have another ecosystem that has the same species. So they have the same species richness, same number of species. But because the one on the right, the species are more evenly distributed than the one on the left. If you look here on the left, you'll see that most of the individuals here are this pink flower. So it is considered less evenly distributed. And even though both have the same species richness, the one on the right would be considered more diverse. Just so you guys have an idea that is commonly how we use these diversity indices. But most often what you'll see quoted in publications for the general public, probably you've seen this in news pieces, in newspapers, is species richness, okay? Some other useful ideas that we touch on when we talk about diversity is that we have alpha diversity. So that's the species richness of one place, one site. Could be the species richness of one city, Bogotá, Medellín, Riohacha, Leticia. And then we have beta diversity. So that's we call that species turnover across a landscape. So that would kind of give us an idea of the difference in species compositions between different sites, right? So the differences between the cities that I mentioned before. If we look here at this picture, this diagram I have, you can see that you have, let's call these different sites, and they have these flowers, right? And some of the species here are the same and some are not. So the beta diversity would measure sort of that difference in species. But also, this is a very important concept to understand because we're going to talk about it today. We have endemic species, species found only in one place, right? So in this picture, we have, for example, this green grass, this black flower, and this red flower are endemic only to these little sites, okay? So that's what we mean when we talk about endemic species. They're found there and no place else. Okay, so now that you understand how we measure species diversity, species richness in this case, I want to challenge you because most likely a lot of you have, if not seen this movie, you've at least seen images from the movie and the poster. How many different species can you see in this poster? So take 30 seconds. How many species can you see? How many plants and how many animals can you see here? Now, it doesn't matter if you can name them or name the scientific name. Just for you, how much variety can you see here? Okay, time's up. So there's actually quite a lot of variety here. I would say this is probably the most biodiverse Disney movie poster to date. The movie makers were very inspired in Colombia when they actually came to Colombia. They visited a lot of different sites. And aside from capturing the diversity and the story of the family, they were really struck by the biodiversity of Colombia. And they really wanted to capture this. So they worked with biologists and a Colombian cultural trust to actually put species that are real species in this movie. Some of them are not exactly real species, but you can actually see a lot of the biodiversity in Colombia here. And this is only a tiny, tiny sampling, right? Here you can also see, in Antonio is the little boy's name. He really talks a lot with animals, and you can see just about, I think, 10 different real life species, and then 2 species, which I wasn't actually able to place, right? And biodiversity features prominently in this scene. Even if you look at the phonograph here to the left, I think, of your image, you can see also iconic species. You have the orchids, right? And if I go back to the previous image, a plant that figures prominently in this movie is, of course, the national tree of Colombia, the Quindío wax palm. Okay, so that's kind of biodiversity captured in cartoon, but let's look at the real biodiversity that we have in Colombia. So probably you've heard at some point in your life, Colombia, mega diverse country, no? Colombia, mega diversa. But what does that actually mean and where does that come from? Okay, so in the world, there are 17 megadiverse countries. Actually now 18 because they've added France since it has a lot of overseas territories in South America, the Guyanas, in the South Pacific. It's also now considered a megadiverse country. So if you look at these countries in green on this map, these countries all together are said to host between 70 to 80% of all worldwide biodiversity, right? So that means that 70 to 80% of the species worldwide can be found in just these 17 countries, right? But the concept comes from the late 80s. It was actually pushed forth by Conservation International as sort of a way to identify countries that deserve special conservation attention, right? Countries that are particularly rich. And there are two criteria to be considered a megadiverse country. One is they have to have at least 0.5% of the world's plants, which is a lot. There are some sources that say they need to have at least 5,000 species of plants, but in reality, because we know more now than back when this concept was made, I think you would need to have about 125,000 plant species to be able to actually encompass this. So rich variety of plants, but also you have to have marine ecosystems. So right there, Colombia definitely qualifies, right? We have Caribbean and Pacific coasts, and as you're going to see, we have a lot of plants. And very often, these countries also have a high number of endemic species. So how does Colombia rank compared to some of these other rich countries, especially these very large countries like the US and China? Because you can say, oh, well, they have a lot of biodiversity because they're so big. Colombia is much smaller, and yet we still have a lot of diversity. Well, in 2016, and actually these numbers are updated for 2021, mangabay.com did an exercise where they looked at the species richness found in the top 10 most biodiverse countries, and they ranked them against each other. And Colombia overall, over 5 different taxonomic groups, is ranked 3rd, just after Brazil and Indonesia, okay? So they looked at the diversity of birds, the diversity of amphibians, the diversity of mammals, the diversity of reptiles, fish, and vascular plants, right? Colombia ranks 1st in terms of richness of birds and 2nd in terms of amphibians. And finally, 3rd in terms of plants. That's quite a lot, especially when you compare it to a country like Brazil, which has much more land area, okay? Just so you know, it doesn't show the ranking here, but actually Colombia is the 2nd most rich country in tree species in the world. That's pretty impressive. And it's 10th in terms of endemic species richness, again, over these 5 groups. Just so you have an idea of numbers, for example, for trees, there's about 60,000 known tree species in the world, I should say known to science. And in terms of endemic tree species, Colombia has over 1,200 endemic tree species. That's quite a lot. This is another way that we can appreciate the biodiversity of Colombia. So this map, the way that we interpret it, they're called heat maps, is that cooler colors, blues and greens, are lower numbers, and yellows, oranges, and reds are higher numbers. So what this is showing us is kind of the concentration of species, the species richness in 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer areas on this map, right? And you can see that Colombia, if we were to draw the political borders, encompasses some areas that have very high species richness in terms of birds, in terms of mammals, and then again in terms of amphibians. And when we look at what we consider species that have small spatial ranges, we can see that Colombia, especially in the 3 Andean regions, encompasses quite a bit of richness, especially for birds and for amphibians. Actually, almost all of this falls within Colombia. And some of these small range species are endemic species. Great. So again, Colombia concentrates a lot of endemic species. This is yet another way to look at the richness Colombia has. This was from a study that looked at, let's say, the number of endemic species, to simplify it, the number of endemic species in predetermined geographical areas. And again, pink and sort of purple colors means higher endemic species richness. And you can see that for all of these groups, vascular plants, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, Colombia is high in endemic species, very rich as well. I want to call your attention, especially here, to this part, which is the Chocó Darien region. We have a lot of endemism in that area. It's very important for biodiversity in Colombia. Great. And so I want to sort of end our talk about species richness in Colombia by looking a little bit at bird diversity, because we do have that distinction of having the most number of bird species in the world. And this is very much a point of pride for birding guides in Colombia, as well as for ornithologists. The second ranking country is Peru, and the third ranking is Ecuador. So Colombia has 1,864 known to science species of birds and 94 endemic species, okay? So here to the right, I've put just a sampling of those 94 endemic species, and they range from very colorful small birds to not so colorful larger birds, not as charismatic as, say, these beautiful hummingbirds that we have here, but still important, right? And Colombia encompasses a number of what we call important bird and biodiversity areas. This is a designation made by an organization called BirdLife International. And they designate important bird areas, geographic regions and sites that are very important for birds that are breeding or as bird habitat. So Colombia has about 8.2% of its national territory comprises important bird areas. This is from resident birds to birds that migrate, right? Especially areas like the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta is home to a lot of migratory bird species as well as endemic bird species. Because endemic bird species are found only in Colombia, a lot of them are considered vulnerable to for extinction or threatened, right? Not all of them, but a lot of them have very restricted areas, and so they're susceptible to anything that affects that restricted area and their habitat. Okay, so that was the richness of species, but Colombia is also very rich in terms of ecosystems. And again, the makers of Encanto picked up a lot on this and encompassed a little bit of this in the movie. In the movie, we can actually see at least three sort of broad ecosystem types. We see the lower montane forest that we see a lot in the Andes. In the Eje Cafetero, it's kind of the prime coffee growing elevations. We see clear water head streams in this scene, which is definitely much inspired in sort of Caño Cristales. And I want to highlight here, Caño Cristales is this colorful array of algae created by an endemic species, Macarena clavijera, right? And also Antonio's room, the little boy's room, is sort of an imagining of tropical moist broadleaf forest, which is which we can find not only in the Amazon, but also in the Chocó Darien region. Okay, so there's high diversity of biomes and ecosystems. That was just a sampling of 3. But according to IDEAM's 2017 mapping of ecosystems, Colombia has 91 types of ecosystems, 70 of which are natural ecosystems and 21 which they consider transformed ecosystems. So these would be ecosystems that have been cleared and changed into some other thing, Typically, they've been converted to agriculture. So those would be considered agricultural ecosystems. If you look at this map here, so I haven't put the key up here, but the different colors are different ecosystems. So that just gives you an idea spatially that we are highly diverse, particularly as we get closer to the Andes. Okay. Before I move on from this, I do want to note that I'm going to talk about the natural ecosystems, but as I said, there are a number of transformed ecosystems, and you can actually see them here in this map, sort of this pink, or depending on your screen, you might see it as beige areas. These are all areas that have been majorly transformed to agriculture. And so we can see the impact that we as human beings have had on this ecosystem diversity. Okay, so there's 25 terrestrial ecosystems in Colombia, according to IDEAM. This is just sort of a small sampling. They define them, their ecosystems, according to several things. The vegetation community that you see above, so the type of vegetation, it's a type of biological community, the soils, and the climate. So these three things combined are how ecosystems are defined. And you have a natural sense of ecosystems, as I'm going to explain them for a little bit more. So I've sort of grouped them here because I couldn't give you examples exactly of everything. But Colombia has a number of wet and dry forests, and these range from very lowland wet forests to things that you have the dry forests that you can find closer to the coast. So these are kind of seasonal forests where some trees lose their leaves because you have a very marked wet and dry season, to the montane forest that you see going up into the Andes, right? We also have high Andean forests as well. They're very unknown, and I haven't included a photo of them here, but they're forests dominated by one tree genus called Polylepis trees, and those are only found in the high Andes, right? There are ecosystems that are considered rocky complexes. So these are systems that you can find in the serranías and the sierras that have very rocky substrate, the tepuis going into Orinoquia. And because they have these different substrates, they tend to have plants that are very specific and can grow in these sort of harsh sites. There's another group of ecosystems that are scrub and brush, and we can find those both in the high Andes and lowlands. Seasonal savannas that we can find, especially closer to the coast, the Caribbean coast. A number of arid and desert ecosystems, things like La Guajira, very, very arid system, el desierto de la Tatacoa, right? And then as we get, we have a number of grasslands and forelands. So these are things that are dominated by grasses and herbs. So we have things like the Llanos Orientales, which can also be considered a type of savanna, as well as some of the high savannas that we have, say, around the Sabana de Bogotá. And finally, when we get to very high elevations, we have the páramos húmedos, and finally, glaciers. Where there are living things as well, you get very high elevation algae, for example. We have a variety of aquatic ecosystems. So these range from the floodplains of rivers, and this generates very specific types of forests as well as grasses that can grow here. So these are seasonally flooded when you have wet and dry seasons, as well as sort of changes, dramatic changes in the riverbed. So we see these places in Magdalena, the lower Magdalena, as well as Orinoquia and Amazonia, right? We have, in general, large lakes. We have large lakes, oxbow lakes in the Amazon region, and then we also have highland lakes. Here we have two of the largest lakes in Colombia, La Laguna de Tota in Boyacá, as well as Laguna Gamuez, also known as Lago de la Cocha in Nariño. We also have, in the aquatic ecosystems, areas that are perennially saturated with water. So those are our highland, peatland bogs and wetlands, right? As well as some bogs in the lowlands. And we have a variety of rivers. I want to highlight this because very often we're concentrated in terrestrial ecosystems, but we don't realize that we have a richness of rivers that have not only different species, but they're different. They're different because they have different nutrients from where they originate. So we have three types of rivers. In Colombia, we have what we consider whitewater rivers. And here you can see it in this image. I'm passing my mouse over it. These are rivers that come loaded with sediments, very muddy rivers, right? That's when you get down to the Amazon River, the lowland Magdalena. This is what you see. It's our whitewater river. Then in some areas that drain lowlands with sand substrates, we find this very much in Amazonia, we have what we consider black water rivers. So these are rivers that when you pick it up, if you were able to pick up some water in a cup, they kind of look like you're drinking dark tea, black tea. So this is another type of river, and they behave differently because they have sort of different water chemistries. They host different species as well. And finally, we have in Colombia, we're lucky enough to get clear water rivers, like the small stream where Caño Cristal originates. And these clear water rivers, you could consider that some of the highland Andean rivers start out as clear water rivers, but we find them mostly in Orinoquia, places that drain sort of very rocky substrates because it drains the Guyana Shield. So we get crystal clear waters that also host different species. We have a variety of coastal ecosystems, so we also get different forests. A lot of these are floodplain forests, but they have different species because you also get the influence sometimes as we get closer to the coast of brackish waters. So these are waters that get the influence of a little bit of salt. They host different species. And then we have the swamps and salt marshes, as well as mangroves, right? They have 4 different species of trees that are tolerant of salty water, as well as tidal flats, so areas where the tide comes in and out. They generate habitat for different types of crustaceans and even some little fish that stay in these tidal pools, as well as our coastal beaches. And we, being privileged in Colombia to have 2 coasts, have different types of beaches. The waters are different, Caribbean and Pacific, very different types of oceans. And finally, we have a variety of marine ecosystems. We have coral reefs in both the Caribbean and Pacific, as well as something that is less well known, I think, by the general public. We have a lot of seagrass beds. And so these are a different type of ecosystem that hosts a variety of different fishes, right? Marine ecosystems can also be divided according to the type of substrate they have, whether it's sandy or rocky, not coral-based, but I won't touch on that very much. So I think you get the general idea that we have a high variety of ecosystems as well. So high species richness and high diversity in terms of ecosystems. Okay. But now the question that you're probably asking yourself is, well, why do we have so much biodiversity? Okay. And there's sort of 3 main groupings of hypotheses that we talk about in ecology that I want to tell you about, that I think personally explains Colombia's rich biodiversity. That's its location, its past history, and the rich variety of geographies and climates that it encompasses. Okay, so first, Colombia is located basically equatorial. So we range from about almost 3 degrees just south of the equator to, I believe, 12 degrees north. I could be wrong about that. Someone can correct me. Because we're at this tropical location, we get a lot of solar energy. So in this map, as you can see, this red is indicating the areas that get the most energy throughout a year, right? More sun, high rainfall as well that we get in the tropics, fuels a lot of production of vegetation. Especially, so think about like the Chocó rainforest, which is actually one of the areas in the world that gets the most rainfall in a year. Very high productivity, so we get a lot of plants. More plants is more food for animals. That means there can be more of them. More higher populations means we can have potentially more species because they can share different resources, right? And this sort of nice climate is also more stable. So we don't have a strong seasonality besides, say, more rain and less rain, or dry periods, wet periods. We don't have winters like we get in the northern hemisphere or very southern hemisphere. So animals can be year round. They can breed pretty much year round, and they don't have necessarily limitations of food. And plants can grow year round as well. So this creates sort of a recipe of more food, greater populations. It also allows for the metabolisms of animals to be higher. So some people propose that this allows for more faster breeding, which leads to a faster evolution, as well as because the environment is stable, less extinction over time, we accumulate more species. That's one idea. Another idea, which is not unrelated and it's not exclusive of the last idea, is that Colombia is located in an area that has a rich past history. It already was in a place that was tropical, that already had a lot of species. But also, specifically for Colombia, I want to note that there was kind of a radical change in the past. So Colombia used to be part of this great lake here that you can see called the Tebas Formation, right? And this great lake existed before the Andes rose. This great lake was big and enabled for a lot of aquatic species, freshwater species. And as the Andes rose, actually, we got the formations of today's rivers. We got the formation of the Amazon River. It's not shown here, but of the Orinoco River system that comes here, and the Magdalena River. So we went from a lake to having many different rivers and streams and catchments. And this sort of isolation over time of the Magdalena, the Orinoco, and the Amazon River system fueled isolation of different species. Not only aquatic species, but terrestrial species. And this isolation over time leads to speciation. So that's another explanation specifically in Colombia of why we have such a rich diversity of fishes and why we also have some terrestrial species that kind of differ between these basins, right? And then finally, Colombia has a highly varied geography. Here I put a map of 3 abiotic influences. So abiotic means non-living influences on the ecosystems. We have highly varied climates, partly because we have such mountainous terrains ranging from 0 meters above sea level to almost 5,000 meters. I can't remember right now what the highest elevation of Colombia is, but it's pretty high. And we have also the Andes that in Colombia specifically divide into the 3 cordilleras, right? And so they create these deep valleys that are warm. And these 3 cordilleras have acted in the past as barriers to the movement of plants and animals. And that tends to fuel speciation and, again, endemism, right? That also combines with highly varied soils. So we often don't think about the soils, but Colombia has a rich variety of soils as well. And that determines what plants can grow, as well as creates this area where you can have plants that speciate and specialize in certain types of soils, and eventually over time increase the diversity. So again, this is sort of a third factor that creates the richness of Colombia. Okay, great. We still have some time, so I want to end with a closing thought. We've talked a lot about this biological richness, and I want to introduce the idea that we should actually think about biological and cultural diversity of Colombia together. And why is this? Well, actually, there is a strong parallel between biodiversity and cultural diversity, not only in Colombia, but worldwide. So this is actually a study that some linguists have done. And what we see here is a map that shows the top 25 countries in terms of the number of endemic vertebrate species and the number of endemic languages, right? And the countries that you see here in this brown color are countries that are in the top 25 for both endemic vertebrates and endemic languages, right? And you can do this exercise for other ways of measuring diversity, but the same sort of result is what we get, is that we have in Colombia and some of these other countries this sort of relationship between high endemism in languages as well as cultures and high endemism in different biological groups. And people have proposed that it's because biodiversity and cultural diversity are not independent. Some of the influences that I mentioned before, the geographic isolation also leads to cultural diversity, but we are also, our culture stems from how we interact with our environment. The more varied the environment, the more varied we can become, right? So Colombia has incredible cultural diversity currently, and it had incredible indigenous diversity and continues to have incredible indigenous diversity as well. So here's a map just to show you, you can see a variety of colors of both traditional indigenous territories and traditional indigenous languages, right? So the Organización Nacional Indígena de Colombia, ONIC, recognizes 102 indigenous peoples or indigenous tribes within Colombia, and the central government recognizes around 61 indigenous languages, right? There could be more, that I'm going to leave that to the linguists, that are perhaps not recognized, and we're probably not even counting things that perhaps unfortunately went extinct since Spanish arrival, right? And all of these cultures originated and acclimatized to the environment. But I also want to note that not only this relationship between biodiversity and cultural diversity is not one direction only, it's bidirectional. People have also influenced the biodiversity of Colombia. Just as a little side note, for example, in the Amazon, not only in Colombia, but the entire Amazon basin, recent research has shown that actually near areas of archaeological sites or high diversity of cultures, you also find that you have a different diversity of trees. So people, even if they're not necessarily domesticating trees all the time, they can favor trees that are useful to them. And they found this correlation that, hey, trees that are near areas that are near old settlements, rich archaeological sites, because the Amazon actually was this pristine area. It's an area where people have lived for many, many, many thousands of years. We get a composition that is different. We get trees that have been favored by people. Okay. And with that, I want to say that we have in Colombia a rich potential to tap into this wild agrobiodiversity that is extremely, extremely high. This is a study that just came out very recently in 2022, and they looked at cultivated and wild agrobiodiversity in all of Colombia, going to different areas. And they found that Colombia is extremely rich in edible plants. We have 3,805 food plants, a lot of which are native not only introduced food plants. And when you consider that globally, there's a little bit more than 7,000 edible species, Colombia has over half of those edible species. That's incredibly rich, right? Here I've shown a sampling that the authors showed of just some of that native agrobiodiversity. Not all of these are cultivated or domesticated, but they're definitely edible plants that traditionally people used, but a lot of that knowledge has been lost. And so there's a parallel between the loss of biodiversity and the loss of cultural diversity. And kind of the message that I want to give is we need to work a little harder at preserving our culture and our biodiversity together because they're not separate. So here, I just wanted to show again this heat map that looked at species richness and endemic species of Colombia in these edible plants. And you can see that, for example, for species richness, areas like Cundinamarca, Boyacá, Santander, Caldas, extremely high in edible plants. But we also have high endemism in departments like Guainía, Amazonas, Vaupés, Nariño, and La Guajira, as well as the Sierra Nevada region here. That's a great potential for continuing to increase our food security locally, right? So there's been sort of this movement to push to sort of technify and industrialize our agriculture, but at the danger of losing some of these species, and not only some of the species, but some of this knowledge about how these plants can be used. And that only makes our culture poorer, I would say. So I wanted to read this ending quote by these authors. They say, despite the unrivaled richness of edible plant species characterizing the Colombian territory, today, 90% of the natural ingredients marketed in the country are imported. So think about that. We're losing an incredible opportunity to be self-sufficient and to use the richness that we have, okay? So with that, I just want to leave that parting thought. If we conserve our biodiversity, we're also conserving our cultural diversity and vice versa. All right, thank you very much. I'm ready for any questions that you might have. And if you wish to contact me about anything, you can write to me at the lower.
Laura, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. It was with a lot of references to cinema, and you mixed it up with the biodiversity, but also with the languages, which was
Bueno, parece que Omar se congeló en la pantalla, entonces vamos a recibir las preguntas vía chat aquí. Adelante, Caro, ¿me pasas la pregunta, por favor? Okay, I sort of saw the question very briefly. Let's see. Storake say, okay, the origin was the existence of sea. Okay. Oh, gracias por la pregunta, Doris. I can answer both in English and Spanish. Is there a preference, Caro and Karime? Puedo contestar en español. ¿Qué prefieren? Ya. Aquí Doris pregunta sobre si los estoraques que se encuentran en Bucaramanga están ahí porque había hace mucho tiempo pues la gran laguna o parte marina ahí. La verdad, yo no sé nada de eso, no podría contestar, pero puede ser que sea esa influencia. Esa es una muy buena pregunta. Ahora me metiste la curiosidad y voy a buscarlo. Voy a buscar la información de eso, pero de hecho debe haber alguna información por ahí.
Super Laura, estaba diciendo antes de que se me fuera el internet que nos estaban acompañando de varias regionales. Agradecemos a todos los compañeros aprendices que se conectan desde Tunja, Putumayo, San Andrés, Cartagena, muchas regiones del país. Creo que la charla precisamente dio gusto para que varios de ellos vieran la biodiversidad que representa Colombia, un territorio que, si bien es no tan gigante como otros países, realmente cuenta con una biodiversidad impresionante y muy destacable. Bien, hay bastantes comentarios en el chat, Laura. Creo que ya respondiste la pregunta sobre los estoraques que nos hacía Doris, ¿verdad? No sé si hayan más preguntas que nos quisieran formular desde el chat de YouTube, ¿verdad? Okay. Jamie González dice que es muy interesante la información, así es. Precisamente la charla de Laura hoy venía muy de esa línea, ¿no? Para ver esa riqueza que tenemos, ¿no es cierto? Y bueno, una referencia importante a Encanto, que es uno de los componentes importantes del cine estadounidense, recientemente elogiando la biodiversidad colombiana. Laura, tenemos algunas preguntas preparadas mientras de pronto alguien más del público se anima. Algo que queríamos preguntarte desde el equipo que organizó este evento tiene que ver con el acuerdo de Escazú. Recientemente se aprobó en cuarto debate este proyecto de ley, por medio del cual se aprueba el acuerdo regional sobre el acceso a la información y el acceso a la justicia en asuntos ambientales, ¿cierto? Esto, digamos, es algo muy nuevo en Colombia. Ya lo adoptan 24 países en América Latina y el Caribe. Un acuerdo que fue firmado ya hace 4 años en Escazú, Costa Rica. Por eso es denominado de esa manera, el Acuerdo de Escazú. ¿Qué sabes tú al respecto de este acuerdo y qué opinión te merece la vinculación de Colombia al acuerdo?
Claro. Bueno, básicamente el acuerdo es algo, digamos, no legal, pero es un acuerdo entre países que busca un poquito estandarizar y realzar el derecho a tener acceso a información sobre procesos ambientales, procesos que puedan afectar nuestro ambiente, y también tener acceso a la justicia, o sea, buscar recursos legales, brindar recursos legales a la población, a ti y a mí, frente a cualquier tema o delito ambiental, ¿no? Entonces, en teoría, Colombia ya tiene varias de esas cosas en sus leyes, etcétera, pero, y otros países también lo tienen, pero lo que este acuerdo busca es como estandarizar esto a través de varios países, ¿no? Yo creo que Colombia debería suscribirse a este acuerdo, si bien ya tiene ciertos estándares que se consideran altos, nunca hace mal tener un acuerdo firmado donde es un recurso donde la población podría decir, ajá, mire, al gobierno, usted firmó esto y tiene que cumplirlo, ¿no? Ahora, es de nosotros, la población, hacer que el gobierno cumpla esto al fin y al cabo, porque no es un mecanismo legal, ¿no? Pero esa es mi opinión.
Súper, Laura, muchas gracias por darnos tu opinión al respecto, porque si bien es un tema nuevo, hay que comenzar a abordarlo y creo que es acceso a información muy importante y Colombia debe estar allí participando en este acuerdo. Una última pregunta para dejarte ir, tiene que ver con unos datos un poco fuertes, ¿cierto? Cifras de deforestación que se han dado en por parte del IDEAM en julio de 2021 sobre la pérdida total de bosques que fue detectada en 2020. Esta cifra está alrededor de las 171.000 hectáreas perdidas, ¿cierto? Deforestadas, y fue un 8% superior al 2019, ¿cierto? Entre enero y junio del 2020 se deforestaron cerca de 64.500 hectáreas, Laura. Y en el mismo periodo de 2021, 42.000 hectáreas. Si bien representa una reducción, no deja de ser impactante este dato. ¿Cómo crees, digamos, desde la experticia que tú tienes, el conocimiento que dominas, cómo equiparar la sostenibilidad, que es uno de los temas que más nos llama la atención últimamente, con el desarrollo económico de las empresas, para que tengamos posibilidades de mejorar, si bien la capacidad económica del país, sin perder necesariamente los bosques?
Claro, ¿cómo hacemos para continuar desarrollándonos, entre comillas, sin perder nuestra riqueza natural? Bueno, en
Y la
realidad,
biodiversidad que allí se encuentra.
correcto. Es una pregunta compleja, pero yo diría que tenemos que desarrollar una visión más allá del bienestar, ¿no? No solo el desarrollo como desarrollo económico, monetario, ¿no? A través de empresas, sino el bienestar de la población en general. Hasta los pequeños agricultores que no necesariamente están vinculados a una gran empresa, pero están afectados por lo que hacen las empresas. Uno es respetar nuestras áreas protegidas y nuestros territorios ancestrales, ¿no? Porque ya hay, de cierta forma, ellos tienen protección cuando son formalmente reconocidos, y hacer valer, ¿no? Con el peso de la ley cuando hay una infracción en esos. También dar más reconocimiento a las comunidades indígenas, campesinas, afrocolombianas, de que ellos pueden gestionar sus territorios y no sobreponer los derechos de una empresa sobre los derechos de ellos, ¿no? Para explotar los recursos que hay ahí. Tenemos que desarrollar un chip de que podemos hacer desarrollo sin que eso signifique gran agroindustria necesariamente. Entonces yo creo que tenemos que aperturar y abrir la mente de cómo podemos utilizar el conocimiento que ya tenemos de la biodiversidad, estos conocimientos tradicionales, ancestrales, para retornar un poquito y equiparar la revolución verde con la sostenibilidad, ¿no? Que muchas prácticas ancestrales pueden darnos algunas respuestas y algunas opciones ante eso.
Perfecto, Laura, creo que queda más que claro, y bueno, coincidimos allí porque sin duda alguna hay que empoderar a los territorios, en ese sentido las comunidades étnicas, los grupos étnicos, los indígenas, sin duda allí tienen un valor clave en ese proceso. Laura, se nos acaba el tiempo, mi internet está terrible, además, como te has podido dar cuenta. Sin embargo, creo que ha sido un espacio bellísimo, te agradecemos a ti por este espacio, por compartir este conocimiento de manera bilingüe, una charla en inglés con subtítulos en español, interacción también en nuestra lengua, junto con compañeros de diferentes regionales del SENA. No sé si quisieras decir algo ya para cerrar y nos despedimos dándote las gracias por nuevamente reiterar por este espacio, por tu tiempo. Y bueno, esperamos que quede esto para la posteridad. Lo dejaremos disponible en los canales del sistema de bibliotecas, en el sitio web del programa de bilingüismo para posterior consulta de los interesados. Muchas gracias, Laura.
Perfecto, muchas gracias a todos y espero que mañana, cuando salgan a su día a día, vean el mundo con otros ojos.
Perfecto, Laura, que así sea, lo haremos de esa misma manera. Yo creo que desde ya lo podemos hacer. Muchísimas gracias, Laura. A todos un abrazo desde la distancia, un abrazo muy fraterno. Les agradecemos por su asistencia, por su acompañamiento, y veamos el mundo de una forma diferente, como Laura nos invita. Un abrazo, que estén bien.
Adiós.
Chao.